Hello and welcome again to a new lecture on EU-Russian relations. We are going to talk today about something very specific to EU-Russian relations, I mean cross-border cooperation and some regional issues in EU-Russian relations. And firstly we will talk about Kaliningrad, which is a peculiar region in Russia, which is separated from the mainland of Russia. Kaliningrad was not that much of a problem back in the Soviet time because of the Baltic countries, but now Kaliningrad is separated from the mainland of Russia. So here's the short map, just to remind you about that. Yeah, so sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania. And basically when the issue emerged at the beginning of the 1990s, the key problem was how to enable transit between Kaliningrad and the mainland of Russia, between two different parts of Russia. But of course there are many other issues that are linked to Kaliningrad. We know that Kaliningrad used to be Königsberg, used to be part of East Prussia, and even Emmanuel Kant is buried there. Moreover, there is another issue, and the issue which is in a way a reference to Western Berlin that was used by Russia, sort of like an emotional reference that some parts of the population of Russia are isolated from the rest of Russia. So when Kaliningrad emerged as a problem, initially it was not an issue of EU-Russian relations, but following the application of Lithuania and Poland for the European Union membership, it did become a problem of EU-Russian relations as well. And initially the positions of two sides were quite different. The European Union argued that Kaliningrad was Russia's internal problem, and therefore Russia had to decide what to do with it. The European Union prepared a communication on Kaliningrad where it discussed some trade preferences, where it discussed some energy supply, border crossing, migration. But basically it gave priority to low politics issues like healthcare, housing, environment. Russia argued that basically the European Union created a problem because of the process of enlargement, and therefore it was up to the European Union to solve it. And at the same time, Russia, and especially the residents of Kaliningrad, thought that the EU's enlargement could also be beneficial for Kaliningrad, for the development of Kaliningrad, and beneficial for the development of EU-Russian relations at large. What solutions did the European Union offer at the end of the day? Legal approximation with the EU's legislation so that Kaliningrad forms a part of EU internal market. Transparent policy in the field of transportation so that Kaliningrad benefits from its location. Placing Kaliningrad energy system into the EU's one so that energy supply issues will be taken out of the agenda, division of fishing areas, decrease of social tension, and inclusion of Kaliningrad into the information space. The problem with Russia, of course, was of two kinds. Well, firstly, Russia had to develop its own solutions, and it did develop along mostly economic sphere. First, in 1996, Russia developed a special economic zone legislation for Kaliningrad, which was based on tax exemption for import to Kaliningrad. In 2006, the concept of the special economic zone was reformed, and currently it is based not on custom benefits, but on tax benefits for big companies. A special zone for tourism and recreation was set up to take into account the specificity of the environmental setting of the Koranian spit. And then Russia also introduced a special federal program, and finally in 2006 Russia adopted a gambling law which basically outlawed gambling in big cities and put all gambling into 4 regions of Russia, of which Kaliningrad is one. In terms of the second and more conceptual issue, Basically, Russia had to decide whether to adopt a specific solution for Kaliningrad, and in that sense treat it differently from the rest of Russia. That was one solution. That was a simplistic solution. That was a suggestion of the European Union as well, if you go back to the ideas presented by Brussels. But at the same time, it was a problem for Russia because of the whole centralization process and because of its unwillingness, Moscow's unwillingness, to create two types of regions and two types of citizens. And therefore, as a solution to this sort of like deadlock, some specialists proposed that Russia would go for sort of like midterm option in which Kaliningrad is just a pilot region, a tasting ground for deeper cooperation between Russia and the European Union. That sort of like stayed dormant, and Kaliningrad still enjoys just preferences in terms of the special economic zone, in terms of the gambling zone, in terms of the special recreation zone, benefits given by the Russian legislation, but the special status of Kaliningrad, be it a pilot project, special, was just like put aside. A more important, a more imminent, more sort of immediate issue to solve was the issue of transit solution for Kaliningrad. In 2002, Russia, Lithuania, and the European Union agreed on transit for people, and the trilateral agreement was eventually signed in 2003. Well, according to that solution, if people go by railway, they do not need a visa. But that only applies to Russian trains, and that only applies to Russian citizens going through Belarus. If people go by car, then they need to apply for a visa, and they can apply for a long-term visa. It is issued for a year, it's free of charge. Then there are subsidized plans for residents of Russia going regularly from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And then all types of other solutions were discussed in terms of fast train and underground train, but due to technical complications, that was put aside. So simplified visas for people who travel by railway, that's the solution, the unique solution for Kaliningrad. If you want to go by train through from the mainland of Russia to the region of Kaliningrad, you have to be a Russian citizen. You have to buy a ticket at least 26 hours before the actual trip. You have to fill out a questionnaire, and then the Lithuanian border authorities just approve your visit. In exchange, Russia concluded a readmission agreement, first with Lithuania, and then it was enlarged to the European Union. And in fact, these arrangements proved to be working very well. That's what the 2006 report demonstrated. Secondly, we have to discuss the borders between Russia and the European Union in the sense that we can think about borders in two different ways. We can think about borders as division lines, and that's something classical for international relations. That's how we treat borders normally, and that's a traditional state-centric model. Or we can think about borders as a uniting factor, which brings in a postmodernist vision, which basically says, okay, borders actually bring us together. It's a contact point, and this contact point can become a source of new growth. And in fact, in the 1990s, we witnessed a certain change from borders as division lines to borders as contact points. That was mostly due to 1995 enlargement, when Russia and the European Union came in the immediate contact for the first time. And it's due to the policy of Finland, which particularly contributed to it. A gradual transfer of the Schengen rules to the EU's legislation basically affected external borders as well, in terms of the control, but in terms of the policy. But still, Russian-Finnish border is a peculiar case, and an example of a very good cooperation. Cross-border cooperation developed very well throughout the 1990s. mostly because the northwest part of Russia was quite open to that. Regions in the northwest of Russia at no time indicated any sort of secessionist intention, so in that sense they were comfortable in their position and in their dialogue with the federal center. We've had a versatile history of interregional cooperation throughout the medieval times and up until present. Geographical proximity to the European Union, of course, facilitated the dialogue. And last but not least, Karelian links, ethnic Karelian links between Finland and some regions of Russia helped that. Currently, the common border between Russia and the European Union is more than 2,000 kilometers. And there are different regions of cross-border cooperation, which involve Russia and Finland, Russia and the Baltic countries, Russia and Lithuania and Poland, in the case of Kaliningrad. The attitude towards cross-border cooperation is probably more skeptical today compared to the 1990s, and this is due mostly to the re-centralization tendencies in Russia. But at the same time, we have to realize that cross-border cooperation is one of the few areas that survived the crisis of 2014. Now go into a very peculiar case of cross-border cooperation, Northern Dimension. The Northern Dimension as an idea, as a term, was first voiced by Mikhail Gorbachev, but he meant something different from what we have now. When Finland became a member of the European Union, it started looking for its own specificity in the European Union in general, and in the EU's common foreign and security policy in particular. And as a result, Finland suggested using its expertise in Russia, its geographical proximity to Russia, the specificity of Nordic cooperation, to launch a new type of cooperation. So Finland developed this concept in 1998, and then presented it during its first presidency in the European Union in 1999. The initiative was eventually approved in the year 2000, and basically here it comes with the initiative. First of all, Northern Dimension brings together the northwest of Russia, Nordic countries, Baltic countries, and the north of Poland and Germany. So countries that border the Baltic Sea region. And in that sense, we have three types of borders initially included in the Northern Dimension. The border between Russia and the Nordic countries, the border between Russia and the Baltic countries and Poland, meaning Russia and future member states of the European Union, and the borders between New Europe, meaning candidate countries, and Old Europe. So that's what we had when the program was launched. Following the accession of the Baltic countries and Poland to the European Union, the situation of course changed, because gradually the Northern Dimension moved from a really trans-governmental and cross-border cooperation to the type of cooperation that most involved Russia and the European Union, and Norway as well, but we know that Norway is very closely associated with the European Union, and in that sense it's not really different in terms of the regulation or in terms of the policies that it tries to advance. The first action plan for the Northern Dimension was approved in the year 2000. It was approved for 3 years. It mainly concentrated on law politics issues, like infrastructural issues, to make sure that borders are gradually eradicated. Environmental issues, nuclear safety, something that really bordered the member states of the European Union, in particular Nordic countries. Health protection, trade, investment and business, human resources, cooperation with justice and home affairs, all these aspects were here together with two specific focuses, which were regional cross-border cooperation and Kaliningrad. The second action plan of the year 2004-2006 slightly adjusted the borders, slightly adjusted the priorities. The list of priorities was shortened, so some priorities were grouped together, but in general they were left intact, with only one exception. In addition to Kaliningrad, Arctic territories were added emphasis in the second action plan, however, was on participation of all the parties involved. So that the Northern Dimension really became a hole in the wall, as some researchers argued, so that the Northern Dimension really helped to eradicate borders between the European Union and Russia in this case, at least at the regional level. So if we speak about innovations of the Northern Dimension, we firstly have to say that it's definitely cooperation that includes EU partners into the decision making. And that's why there is this notion of the hole in the wall of the European Union. It is particularly strong when we talk about soft security issues. It presupposes strong involvement of both public and private actors, and it definitely had a very strong innovation potential. At the same time, the Northern Dimension was severely criticized. Firstly, it was criticized because it didn't have its own financial mechanism and relied on the funding that was already available in the region. So in that sense, on the one hand, it had some positive impact because it contributed to the realization of the projects that were already in place. At the same time, it was equated to Potemkin's villagers because the Northern Dimension was just a label put on the projects that already existed. The Northern Dimension was also criticized for the fact that different partners had different statuses there. There were members, and that included all member states of the European Union and the Commission, and then there were partners, and that included Russia, Norway, and Iceland, that did not belong to the European Union. Russia also worried that it didn't have real access to the decision-making within the European Union and on Northern Dimension in particular. And in many comments of Russia, the Northern Dimension was actually just downgraded to simple environmental cooperation. However, as the second action plan, the validity period of the second action plan was coming to an end, a big question was looming whether to maintain the Northern Dimension or whether to reform it. And in the year 2005, at the Northern Dimension Ministerial Conference, the parties decided to preserve it, but to drastically reform it. Firstly, they clarified the geographical coverage of the Northern Dimension, saying that it involves EU member states, Russia, Norway, Iceland, and the European Commission and regional councils, and all of them are equal players here. Secondly, because Northern Dimension turned to be mainly about cooperation between Russia and the European Union, it was stressed that Northern Dimension was a regional expression of the four common spaces between Russia and the European Union. And on the basis of that, Russia and the European Union signed a political declaration and a framework document on the Northern Dimension in November 2006. And these documents came into force as of 1st of January 2007. There are two new priority regions, and these are the Baltic Sea and the Barents Sea, in addition to the Kaliningrad and the Arctic region. What about the present and the future of the Northern Dimension? Well, we have to admit that some old problems were preserved. There's no clear financial support marked for the Northern Dimension. The Northern Dimension relies on the EU's regional funding and on Russian funding. It's not quite clear who is a partner on the Russian side, whether it's the federal authorities or regional authorities. In theory, the Northern Dimension only involves the northwest of Russia. In practice, due to the centralization of Russia, central authorities frequently interfere into decision-making, particularly now that Northern Dimension is one of the few areas of cooperation that are still intact in EU-Russian relations. And then the division of competences among different international organizations is still an issue, remains an issue. There are some new problems in terms of actors who were never defined in the documents of the Northern Dimension. It's not quite clear whether these are states, whether these are regional authorities, NGOs, civil society, or anything else. It's still not quite clear how to bring more equality to the Northern Dimension in terms of the equality between Russia and the European Union that Moscow so much insists upon. And then the link between the four common spaces and the northern dimension is not quite clear, in the sense that it still remains to be clarified whether the northern dimension goes at the speed of 4 common spaces, or whether 4 common spaces can actually bring some positive experience, or whether northern dimension can bring some positive experience to 4 spaces, and whether the northern dimension can be this sort of like trial ground, testing case for deepening of cooperation in at least 3 out of 4 areas, 3 meaning excluding external security. And I just repeat that the northern dimension is still vibrant despite the current crisis of EU-Russian relations, and that's one of the few areas that remain intact. Finally, I would like to touch upon the Arctic region. And the Arctic region is quite a complex case, because it's still not divided, and the Arctic parties, to whom the European Union, by the way, does not belong, still have to decide how to divide the area which is reputed to have rich oil and gas resources. The Arctic region is also, in the case of Russia, linked to the prospects of transportation, shorter transportation, more efficient transportation from Europe to Asia, with the possibilities of developing Russian territories in the extreme northern conditions. The issue of environmental protection is, of course, in the agenda, as well as the military presence of most parties, but particularly the United States and Russia. Now, the problem of the European Union is that the European Union actually is not an Arctic player, precisely because no EU member state has state borders in the Arctic. Greenland is frequently referred to, but Greenland left the European Union. Greenland is still a part of Denmark, but not a part of the European Union. Denmark, Sweden and Finland are members of the Barents Euro-Arctic region, but they are not Arctic players as such. However, the EU has growing assertiveness in this region. It justifies it mainly with environmental concerns and with the experience that it has in terms of environmental protection and climate change. But of course, oil and gas resources, as well as fishery resources, attract quite a lot of attention here as well. And therefore, in 2008, the European Union issued the first communication. Then there was an Arctic strategy approved by the European Union in cooperation between the High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy and the Commissioner for External Authorities of the European Commission. And then in 2012, the European Union published yet another communication on the Arctic territory. Russia does not recognize the European Union as an equal player in the Arctic, and that actually falls in line with the position of many other Arctic countries who say that, well, actually we have a sufficient number of players there anyways, and therefore we don't have to enlarge a number of those players any longer. But anyways, the Arctic region definitely remains an area of potential regional cooperation between Russia and the European Union, and it remains to be seen how the priorities of both Russia and the European Union will evolve over time. And this closes our lecture on regional cooperation between Russia and the European Union, and I welcome you to our new lectures on EU-Russian relations shortly.